In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. I was watching this video from Southern Orthodoxy, right? She's a Eastern Orthodox Christian, and she's interviewing this guy named John dilorenzo. He wrote the book on the real Abe Lincoln. So I'm like, thought I'd give him, I don't know, so at least just hear him out, see what he says, right? Because I certainly do not support his position, especially after hearing his interview. And basically, his book is basically attacking Lincoln, right? He's basically attacking Lincoln in his book, the real Abe Lincoln. So I did research, see if this man is, if what he's saying is even legit, right? And so I did find a source, basically discrediting his work, right? Basically showing you that he's not exactly an honest scholar, right? Or an economist, like he says, he's an economist. But he's doing history, and he's looking at it from the economical perspective. And so he's just basically casting a bad light on Lincoln. Like, one of the things he said was something about Lincoln blaming God for slavery or something, or not slavery, blaming God for divine judgment, right, or something like that, or just blaming God for the for the Civil War. Yeah, basically, just blaming God for the Civil War, basically. And then just because he said that it was a divine judgment, right, from God or something, until he basically tried to, you understand what I'm saying? He tried to use that to make basically Lincoln look bad or something. I said this is not, this isn't honest. Civil War being a divine judgment of God, maybe not Civil War, but certainly what Lincoln said is not inconsistent with what the founders say about slavery, right? How God would judge America because of slavery. And yet he's acting like Lincoln is not consistent with the founding. I would say he is more consistent with the founding and the interpretation of the Constitution and Declaration, right? So I wanted to read from here. It says, slavery, the supreme violation of the covenant. It says that the founders believed that the nation's unique mission to advance the cause of liberty entailed a unique responsibility, and the failure to carry out this duty properly might result in a severe national punishment. John Adams wrote in his preface to a defense of the constitutions of government of the United States of America, 1787, saying, quote, "The people in America have now the best opportunity and the greatest trust in their hands that Providence ever committed to so small a number since the transgression of the first pair. If they betray their trust, their guilt will merit even greater punishment than other nations have suffered in the indignation of heaven," end quote. While Adams passing over the biblical Israel as a favorite American precursor to travel all the way back to the Garden of Eden was unusual, his fear of divine judgment was not. For instance, many of the founders warned that God might punish the United States for its institution of slavery, which they regarded as a direct violation of the covenant of liberty between the Almighty and the new Israel. If it were true, as the founders believed, that God had blessed the United States to a unique degree because of its divine mission to advance freedom, it might also be true that in the future he would judge the nation severely for its gross violation of that very principle. Much as God had blessed the former chosen people because of their divine mission to advance ethical monotheism, but sent them into captivity when they fell into forms of immorality and idolatry that violated its defining principles. As early as 1773, Benjamin Rush wrote an essay called, quote, "On the Slave Keeping," end quote, in which he warned of the wrath of God against America because of slavery. He advised the nation's clergymen, if in the Old Testament, it says, if in the Old Testament, quote, "God swears by his holiness and by the excellency of Jacob that the earth shall tremble and everyone mourned that dwelleth therein for the iniquity of those who oppress the poor and crush the needy. End quote. Quote, who buy the poor with silver and the needy with a pair of shoes. End quote. It's Amos 4:1 through 2, 8, 6 through 8. What judgments may you not pronounce upon those who continue to perpetuate these crimes against Africans after the more full discovery which God hath made of the law of equity in the New Testament, put them in the mind of the rod which was held over them a few years ago in the Stamp and Revenue Acts. Remember that national crimes require national punishment, and without declaring what punishment awaits this evil, you may venture to assure them that it cannot pass with impunity unless God shall cease to be just or merciful. End quote. So 2 years later, then, Pius Thomas Paine argued that British tyranny and the American colonies constituted a form of divine judgment on account of slavery. He asked, quote, how just, how suitable to our crime is the punishment with which Providence threatens us. We have enslaved multitudes and shed much innocent blood in doing it, and now we are threatened with the same, and while other evils are confessed and bewailed, why not this especially and publicly, than which no other vice of all others has brought so much guilt on the land, end quote. Yet 7 months later, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Paine portrayed Britain as the more proper object of divine wrath because of its central role in the slave trade and its refusal to allow its prohibition in colonies like Virginia, and expressed the hope that the revolution might serve as a mechanism for ending the injustice. He claimed, quote, I firmly believe that the Almighty, in compassion to mankind, will curtail the power of Britain. I hesitate not for a moment to believe that the Almighty will finally separate America from Britain. Call it independence or what you will. If it is the cause of God and humanity, it will go on. And when the Almighty shall have blessed us and made us a people dependent only upon Him, then may our first gratitude to be shown by an act of continental legislation which shall put a stop to the importation of Negroes for sale, often the hard fate of those already here, and in time procure their freedom, end quote. In notes on the state of Virginia, 1782, Thomas Jefferson expressed anxiety that slavery would bring down God's wrath on the United States. In a famous passage later engraved on a panel at the Jefferson Memorial, he wrote, quote, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with His wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that His justice cannot sleep forever. That considering numbers, nature and natural means only a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situations among possible events, but it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest, end quote. Note that Jefferson's anxiety was not for himself as a slaveholder, but for the nation as a whole, and that he fully expected divine retribution to come through natural means, not generally known for dispensing Jeremiads. Jefferson did add a hopeful postscript, more in line with his optimistic disposition. Quote, the spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying the way of hope preparing under the auspices of heaven for a total emancipation, and that this is disposed in the order of events to be with the consent of the masters rather than by their extirpation, end quote. Jefferson envisioned, quote, total emancipation, end quote, as the inevitable result of the divine will. The only question was whether it would come through peaceful means or by slaughter. A few years later he marveled, quote, what is stupendous, what an incomprehensible machine is man, who can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, and death itself in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment be deaf to all those motives whose power supported him through his trial, and inflict on his fellow man a bondage 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he arose in rebellion to oppose. But we must await with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that is preparing the deliverance of these or our suffering brethren When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress, and by suffusing light and liberality among their oppressors, or at length by his exterminating thunder, manifest his attention to the things of this world, and they are not left to the guidance of a blind fatality. End quote. Jefferson again presented the possibility that divine intervention might take the form of enlightenment rather than destruction, though the latter will still possible. Jefferson was far from alone in his fear of divine retribution for slavery. In 1780, John Jay wrote on to a member of the New York legislature, quote, "An excellent law might be made out of the Pennsylvania, one for the gradual abolition of slavery. Till America comes into this measure, her prayers to heaven for liberty will be impious." This is a strong expression, but it is just. Were I in your legislature, I would never cease moving it until it became a law or I ceased to be a member. I believe God governs this world, and I believe it to be a maxim in his and in our court that those who ask for equity ought to do it. End quote. Some anti-federalists worried that the Constitution would bring down the wrath of God on the nation because it permitted the slave trade to continue another 20 years, as, quote, a countryman, end quote, in New York, anti-federalist and later governor of the state, DeWitt Clinton, contended, quote, "All good Christians must agree that this slave trade is an abomination to the Lord and must, if continued, bring down a heavy judgment upon our land. It does not seem to be justice that one man should take another from his own country and make a slave of him, and yet we are told by this new Constitution that one of its great ends is to establish justice. Alas, my worthy friend, it is a serious thing to trifle with the great God. His punishments are slow but always sure, and the cunning of man, however deep, cannot escape them." End quote. Clinton contrasts God's former blessings of the United States with the divine curse that awaited. Quote, "Even the infidel must confess that God was remarkably generous with us, watched over us in the hour of danger, fought our battles and subdued our enemies, and finally gave us success. Alas, my good friend, it is a terrible thing to mock the Almighty, for how can we expect to merit his favor or escape his vengeance? If it should appear that we were not serious in our professions of the equality of men and their inalienable right in the Declaration of Independence, and that they were mere devices to gratify our pride and ambition, we ought to remember that he sees into the secret recesses of our hearts and knows what is passing there. It becomes us then to bear testimony against everything which may be displeasing in his sight, and be careful that we incur not the charge mentioned by the prophet Hosea 10:13, quote, "Ye have plowed wickedness, ye have reaped iniquity, ye have eaten the fruits of lies, because thou didst trust in thy way, in the multitude of thy mighty men." End quote. The Virginia Anti-Federalist George Mason agreed with its northern counterparts. At the Constitutional Convention, he declared regarding slaves, quote, "They produce the most pernicious effects on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world. There must be in this by an inevitable chain of cause and effects. Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." End quote. Note that Mason envisions God passing judgment not through miracles but through the natural effects of slavery itself. This view did not contradict the Bible, since God's judgment against the nations in the Old Testament, while sometimes accomplished through miracles, often works through natural causes. For instance, God uses Babylonian armies to destroy the Assyrian Empire, Nahum 3, and Persian forces to overwhelm the Babylonian Empire, Daniel 5. In 1790, during a congressional debate regarding a petition submitted by the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery and signed by its president Benjamin Franklin, Elias Boudinot also warned of divine judgment. Boudinot cited the book of Exodus, in which he claimed that many of, quote, "the same arguments have been used on the present occasion had been urged with great violence by the king of Egypt, whose heart, it is expressly said, had been extremely hardened, to show why he should not consent to let the children of Israel go, who had now become absolutely necessary to him. End quote. Buddha now concluded ominously regarding the Hebrew slaves. Quote, gentlemen cannot forget the consequence that followed. They were delivered by a strong hand and outstretched arm, and it ought to be remembered that the almighty power that accomplished their deliverance is the same yesterday, today, and forever. End quote. Hebrews 13:8. Many Americans later considered the Civil War, which remains the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, the fulfillment of the founder's prophecy of divine punishment of the United States for slavery. Did you see what I mean? Like, this is why I don't trust that author. That's why I was like, so I guess who's more consistent though, right? This person who slanders Lincoln tries to exaggerate some of these so-called racist sayings of Lincoln, trying to demonize him, right? And I'm like, well, he is more consistent in thoughts about the Civil War being a punishment from God on America over slavery. So as I've shown you, that's a consistent view that the founders held. So it's not at all Lincoln blaming God. So I don't know, let's say that dilorenzo is being dishonest. This is why I don't like his books. I wanted to put the source that I found refuting his book, The Real Abe Lincoln, right, or The Real Lincoln, I think it was called. And so I see a lot of people trusting him without, I guess, any skepticism. Like they just believe everything that he says, and it's like, well, he's definitely wrong. And so that's why it's like, I thought I just kind of cite some sources that go against what he says. There's other good books, be like this one, Vindicating Lincoln, Defending the Politics of Our Greatest President, by Thomas L. Cranwitter. Goes over a bunch of things like who was right on the founding, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Was Lincoln a racist? Let's see, it says here. This is in this chapter, was Lincoln a racist? This is Americans today find it difficult to understand the grip racial views had on the American mind that Lincoln was trying to influence in the 1850s. Anyone seeking to advance the principle of equality through electoral politics had to speak carefully to the American people. As historian Philip Paulden writes, quote, most white people disliked blacks as a group, as a race that was inferior and coercive of ideals they cherished. They did not want blacks to live, shop, play, learn, celebrate, worship, or even be buried anywhere near them, end quote. In a quote, and it says, in a people's contest, Paludan relates stories of northern whites fighting for the Union Army who refused to serve with black soldiers. It says, quote, many white troops refused to serve with Negroes in the Union-saving struggle, seeing themselves involved in a noble enterprise, sharing the camaraderie that binds soldiers together in intimacies as well as sufferings and death. Whites feared that the presence of black soldiers would debase the cause and bring them down to the level of, quote, this is the N-word, end quote. As a corporal in New York regiment announced, quote, we don't want to fight side by side with the, says N-word. We think we are a too superior race for that, end quote. Given that state of opinion, no white man could hope to be elected dog catcher, much less to a higher office, if he asserted publicly the equality of the black and white races. In one of his books, Attacking Lincoln, dilorenzo spends an entire chapter describing the racism and white supremacy deeply rooted in antebellum, quote, Yankee, end quote, thought. Yet he nowhere acknowledges the constraints that the widely held racism he describes placed on political speech. A far more thoughtful account of the limitations popular opinions placed on speech in America can be found in Alex de Tocqueville's masterly work, Democracy in America. It says, in America, the majority draws a formidable circle around thought. Inside those limits, the writer or speaker is free, but unhappiness awaits him if he dares to leave them. It is not that he has to fear an auto da fe, but he is the butt of mortifications of all kinds and of persecutions every day. A political career is closed to him. He has offended the only power that has the capacity to open it up. Thus he yields, and finally he bends under the effort of each day and returns to silence as if he felt remorse for having spoken the truth. End quote. dilorenzo possesses none of Tocqueville's appreciation for rhetoric and its limitations, and he never considers how Lincoln might appeal to the prejudices of his audience, especially if Lincoln did not share those prejudices, especially if Lincoln did not share those prejudices. Instead, dilorenzo simply chalks Lincoln up as another 19th century racist. Quote, as a man of his time, end quote, dilorenzo asserts, quote, Lincoln held views that can only be described as the views of a white racist, end quote. But this ignores the possibility that Lincoln tried to improve the moral opinions of his audience while crafting his speech to attract and not offend them. When Lincoln was running for the U.S. Senate in 1858, one of the most powerful criticisms his opponent Stephen Douglas made against him was that he was a, quote, black Republican, end quote, who wanted to live and have intimate relations with blacks. Charges met with enthusiastic applause from Douglas, supporters in the audience, mixed with hissing and booing aimed at Lincoln. This is any argument Lincoln might have made for the full equality of blacks. Any argument that openly called for the immediate writing into the law of the full moral and political implications of the principles of the Declaration of Independence would have generated fierce opposition and hostility. No one hoped to advance these principles in an elected political office could possibly make such arguments in public, however much he may have believed them to be true. This is why abolitionists were almost irrelevant politically. They were seen as zealots and lunatics far outside the political mainstream. Although modern Americans may find them uncomfortable, these are nonetheless simple, sad, and undeniable facts of American life in the middle of the 19th century, and we must view Lincoln's rhetoric in light of this reality if we are to understand the political confines within which he had to work. In his debates with Douglas and elsewhere, Lincoln did not openly endorse policies demanding full political and social equality for blacks, but he also never denied that such policies were right or questioned the truthfulness of the proposition that all men are created equal. What are we to make of this? Lincoln certainly catered to the prejudices of his audience, and much as necessity required of him, but I would quickly add he also consistently reserved for himself ground upon which to defend the principle of human equality and all its implications more comprehensively at some later date. In his 1854 speech in Peoria, Illinois, Lincoln lamented, quote, when sovereign people tell us they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact when it is said that the institution exists and that it is very difficult to get rid of in any satisfactory way. I can understand and appreciate the saying. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not do, how to do myself. If all earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do or as to the existing institution. End quote. For reasons mentioned above, the idea of freeing slaves and then colonizing them somewhere outside the United States appealed to Lincoln because it may have appeared to be the only possible solution. Lincoln asked rhetorically whether Americans could, quote, free blacks and make them politically and socially our equals, end quote. He first responded that his, quote, own feelings would not admit of this, end quote, but then quickly shifted attention away from his own opinion, not wanting to clarify or defend it, to emphasize what was more important, the opinions of his fellow Americans. Even, quote, if mine would, end quote, Lincoln said, quote, we will know that those of the great mass of white people will not, end quote. If Lincoln believed that blacks should be the free social and political equals of whites, he knew that openly stating such views would be politically and possibly even literal suicide, which might explain the ambiguity in his statements and his unwillingness to expand on his personal opinions regarding race-related policies. In addition, Lincoln knew that his opinions were far less important and less influential than the opinions of the voting American people, and whether or not public opinion was just or right was not the only question. Quote, whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment, end quote, Lincoln continued in his perilous speech. Quote, it is not the sole question. If needed, it is part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded, end quote, because, quote, universal feeling, end quote, or public opinion places important limitations on what can be achieved through public policy. However much one might lament or loathe public opinion, those who hope to bring about political change in America cannot ignore it. Lincoln concluded that, quote, we cannot then make blacks equals, end quote, precisely because he understood all too well that racial opinions of the vast majority of whites in America. In a self-governing republic, the emancipation of slaves requires the consent of the governed. Where the people do not want emancipation will not happen. Lincoln understood that his first job was to reshape public opinion so that, at a minimum, Americans would discuss the possibility of emancipation rather than evincing racism, as Lincoln critics then and now contend. Lincoln's position demonstrates a prudential concern for the formation of public opinion, public policy, and the rule of law. But when opportunities presented themselves, Lincoln clearly stated his disapproval of slavery. Quote, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy, end quote. It says here, Lincoln on secession. This is immediately after Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, but 4 months before he was sworn into office. Secession movements spread throughout the South, with South Carolina taking the lead. And by the time Lincoln delivered his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, 7 states had already passed ordinances of secession and elected a provisional Confederate government under the authority of a new Confederate Constitution. These seven states claimed to secede not because of any injury caused directly by the Lincoln administration, he was not yet president, but because of various perceived threats to their liberties and interests. It was a preventative measure from their point of view, a, quote, preventative secession, end quote, in their case, rather than a, quote, preventative war, end quote, about which we hear so much today. Eventually, 4 more states joined the original 7, raising the total to the 11 states that would make up the short-lived Confederate States of America, CSA. Lincoln never acknowledged, at least not intentionally, the political sovereignty of the CSA because he did not believe any state possessed a constitutional right of secession. So I say, quote, not intentionally, end quote, because when Lincoln declared a, quote, blockade, end quote, of southern ports, he quickly learned that, quote, blockade, end quote, was a legal term of art that, according to international law, applied to belligerent nations. If Lincoln did not want to acknowledge the independence and sovereignty of the CSA, he should have simply ordered the ports to be, quote, quote, closed, end quote, rather than ordering a, quote, blockade, end quote. From Lincoln's point of view, the Union was unbroken, although he understood that there was significant discontent throughout the South and that a sizable number of sovereign citizens had gathered to draft and ratify ordinances and resolutions declaring secession, all of which Lincoln believed had no constitutional, legal, or otherwise binding authority. When Southerners' cannons fired on April 12, 1861 upon Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, Lincoln interpreted the act as a rebellious assault against the U.S. government and called up a force of 75,000 volunteer troops to squash the revolts. In the days, weeks, and months that followed, Lincoln took many extraordinary measures, including appropriating money from the Treasury without the approval of Congress, which was not in session when the war began, suspending the writ of habeas corpus and other actions that would almost certainly be deemed unconstitutional during any normal time of peace, in order to suppress the rebellion and restore the constitutional union the Civil War had begun. Prior to his inauguration as president, Lincoln reflected deeply on the question of secession, and his thoughts crystallized first in his inaugural address and then in his July 4, 1861 message to Congress in special session. Lincoln took a circuitous train route from Illinois to Washington, D.C., during which he made many short speeches from the rear platform of the train. Along the way, Lincoln asked on more than one occasion why a state could succeed but not a country. The implication of Lincoln's question is clear. If the purpose of secession is to protect a minority from an oppressive majority, which, as I discussed below, is exactly the argument formulated by the sovereign architect of secession, John C. Calhoun, then any argument for a state to secede legally and peacefully from the Union must be an argument for countries to secede from states, and any argument for countries to secede from states must be an argument for towns to secede from counties, neighborhoods from towns, families from neighborhoods. The ultimate and irreducible minority is the individual citizen. Again, if the purpose of secession is to protect a minority against a majority, why may not an individual citizen secede whenever he is displeased by the laws or policies under which he lives? And after individuals become convinced that they have a legal right to secede, that each individual has a legal right to reject the outcome of any election with which he happens to disagree, does not civil society under law become impossible? In principle, secession implies that no law can be truly binding, that anyone who dislikes a law has the right to declare himself or herself exempt from its reach. This is why Lincoln argued in his first inaugural address that, quote, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy, end quote. A state of anarchy or a state of lawlessness is characterized by the rule of might or brute force. Lincoln understood clearly that secession represents nothing less than a movement away from civil society back toward a state of nature and anarchy, a movement away from freedom under law toward slavery without law. Lincoln consistently maintained that the people of the sovereign states, like all people, possess a natural right of revolution but not a legal right of secession, a distinction that was and continues to be blurred or ignored by many Lincoln critics. Quote, all profess to be content in the Union if all constitutional rights can be maintained, end quote. Lincoln rightly observed in his first inaugural address, quote, it is true then that any right plainly written in the Constitution has been denied, end quote. America was born out of revolution, and if Southerners had been injured seriously and were being governed without their consent, they had no less a natural right of revolution than the Americans of 1776 had. But how had Lincoln injured the South? What part of the Constitution had he ignored or violated? He was not even president when South Carolina became the first state to declare secession from the Union. The South had no answer. The seceding states could not justify their actions by recourse to the natural right of revolution in the weeks, months, and years before his inauguration as president. Lincoln was merely a private citizen, Lincoln with no more of a voice in the actions of government than any other citizen. Private citizens, Lincoln had done nothing to injure the people of the sovereign states, and on the sensitive point of slavery, he had stated repeatedly, and he repeated again in his first inaugural address, quote, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists, end quote, because, quote, I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so, end quote. From Lincoln's point of view, the union of the Constitution is perpetual. Quote, I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, end quote. Lincoln announced in his first inaugural address, quote, the union of these states is perpetual, unquote. Perpetuity Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments, end quote. Lincoln continued because, quote, no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. Continue to execute all the express provisions of our national constitution, and the Union will endure forever. It be impossible to destroy it except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself, end quote. The Constitution contains no provision for its own demise. Only two conditions might bring about the end of the constitutional union. One is if some Americans violate the Constitution itself and infringe on the rights of others, causing others to exercise their natural right to replace the Constitution and establish a new government, an act authorized not by the written law of the Constitution, but by the natural law. The second is if some external power, such as an invading army, destroys the authority of the Constitution and prevents its provisions from being put into practice. This is, quote, the Union, end quote, Lincoln maintained, quote, is much older than the Constitution, end quote. The Constitution itself supports Lincoln's argument. The preamble announces that among the purposes of ordinating the Constitution is the effort to, quote, form a more perfect union, end quote, clearly indicating that a union of some kind existed prior to the Constitution. In Article 7, the framers dated the Constitution by two references to the 7th day of September in the year 1787, and, quote, of the independence of the United States of America, the 12th, end quote. If September 1787 was the 12th year of independence, then independence began in 1776. The Constitution, in other words, recognizes the Declaration of Independence of 1776 as the origin of the Union, which the Constitution seeks to make, quote, more perfect, end quote. This one is Challenges to the American Founding. Slavery, Historicism, and Progressivism in the 19th Century has many authors. It's edited by Ronald J. Pistrito and Thomas G. West. It just goes over basically all of the things, same stuff with John C. Calhoun, New Science of Race and Politics. It's kind of like what I'm saying. It kind of sounds like the critical race theory that you hear today with BLM and stuff like that, and Marxism, and how Calhoun is called Marx of the master class. He's a spiritual father of the Confederacy. And like Marxists, he tried to justify revolution through slander, lying, dishonesty, writing propaganda, basically. Because like Robert Lee said, that secession is nothing more than revolution, technically. And I say that when the people that hate Lincoln, they argue for state rights and things like that, but state rights according to whom? You see how the Confederates, like from what I'm reading, right, it's like they interpret the Constitution, I would say, in a heretical way, because it is not at all correct. Totally benefits the slave plantations, right, the slave master class, if I can call them that. That class of people that owns the plantations in the South. It's only they that benefit from slavery, not the blacks, but they try to justify it through this Calhoun's critical racism of black people, how it ties into his views of, the powers of the state, right, state rights, which is code for slavery, and how that institution of slavery ties into the critical racism of Calhoun, right? It's basically what I call, like, I guess it'd be something like white Marxism. At least that's what that sounds like. It's kind of why I say that, like when black people say things that sound ridiculous, when they say that blacks cannot be racist, right? Because they're not positions of authority, right, or something like that. They don't have position of authority, or they lack position of authority. And then this other guy I was listening to, he said that there's no such thing as white inferiority, right? Inferior whites, right? And then when a black person gets criticized, when they're using reason, logic, and truth, right, and they're speaking truth, he gets labeled as being white, right? So all of that ties into, I think, this critical racism, because it presupposes the idea that white is right, white makes right, and white by nature is superior, right? Which goes back to white supremacy and has to do with scientific racism and things like that. So how the BLM kind of presupposes white supremacy is true, right? Because at least that's what it sounds like, but it's like subconscious or codified in a sense. So anyway, I'm reading from John C. Calhoun and the New Science of Race and Politics. Calhoun versus Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln. The argument that each state has a constitutional right to secede from the Union, as it was understood on the eve of the Civil War, was based on the idea that each state is absolutely organically sovereign regarding its internal policies and politics, and that the American Union was nothing but a loose confederacy of sovereign states. This new article of faith was introduced and given its fullest articulation by Calhoun. It was an argument Abraham Lincoln demolished first in speech and then on the battlefield. Conservatives and libertarians who believe the Civil War was a contest between state rights on the one hand and national power on the other hand are mistaken. Rather at the heart of the conflict between the North and the South were two different and incompatible notions of state rights and the nature of the American Union. For the American founders, the legitimate authority of state governments and the national government alike is derived from the consent of the governed, but only as that consent is directed towards the equal protection of equal natural rights. Taking their bearings from a common sense understanding of human nature, the founders understood that human beings are unequal or different in many ways. Some are tall, some are short, some educated, some ignorant, some virtuous, some vicious, but in their possession of natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, among others, all human beings are created equal. No man can legitimately or justly rule over another without the other's consent. Quote, because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord of the person or property of others, end quote, wrote Thomas Jefferson. Tyrannical rule or rule without consent is, quote, unnatural, end quote, or a violation of natural right in this sense. It violates the natural equality of human beings. In the preamble of the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, the idea of government by consent is expressed in these terms. Quote, the body politic is formed by a voluntary association of individuals. It is a social compact by which the whole people covenants with each citizen and each citizen with the whole people, that all shall be governed by a certain law for the common good, end quote. Good government is government that is founded on a, quote, social compact, end quote, wherein each citizen agrees with the whole and the whole agrees with each citizen to be governed by laws directed towards the common good of the people, which means laws that protect the equal rights of individuals. A government by consent is foremost a moral principle, just as no person who does not wish to be a slave should enslave another, so governments should not rule without the consent of the governed. The justification for individual freedom and the justification for government by consent stem from the same moral source. The principle of natural human equality, that is what George Washington meant in his first inaugural address when he said that, quote, the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, end quote. The principles of private morality are immutable because they are derived from human nature, which never changes, and it is human nature that is at once the cause of government and the standard by which all government are to be judged. Calhoun, on the other hand, explicitly rejected the idea of human equality, as we have seen above. He described the idea of human equality as, quote, the most false and dangerous of all political errors, end quote, divorcing state rights from natural rights and therefore undermined the very ground of government by consent. He did this in no small measure because he understood that it was impossible to reconcile government by consent with the, quote, peculiar institution, end quote, of chattel slavery. On the eve of the Civil War, the South also understood that to appeal to the right of revolution, such as Jefferson had in the Declaration of Independence, was to appeal to the idea of individual natural rights, something of which they preferred not to remind those they held as cattle slaves. Thus, the argument for sovereign independence was based upon the constitutional and legal right of secession, as opposed to the natural right of revolution, but in denying the idea of human nature and natural human equality, Calhoun's doctrine of state rights came to rest on nothing but human will, the very antithesis of legitimate government and the rule of law. As Lincoln argued in his message to the special session of Congress, July 4, 1861, secession represents a rejection of constitutional government and government by free election. Lincoln characterizes American constitutionalism as that process through which political disputes are decided by ballots instead of bullets. This is free government operating by majority rule, but majority rule presupposes the equal rights of all those who will compose the majority and the minority. The rights of some can never be the legitimate object of political dispute. They cannot be put up for votes in an election because they are the very ground of free elections. Free government is a result of an agreement between each individual and the whole and each individual that the very purpose of government will be to protect the equal rights of all, those in the minority no less than the majority, with the guarantee that the government will protect the rights of all citizens regardless of the outcome of an election, a guarantee backed by the natural right of revolution. The recourse for a minority that loses an election is the next election in which they can try to become the majority, but this assumes that the losers of an election accept the results of that election and wait to try again. The Calhounian argument for secession is precisely a refusal to accept the result of a free legitimate election. On his way to Washington, D.C., for his inauguration as president, Lincoln gave a speech in Indianapolis, among other places, where he asked why a state could secede, but a country could not. The implication of Lincoln's question is clear. Any argument for a state to legally secede must be an argument for countries to secede, and any argument for countries to legally secede must be an argument for towns, neighborhoods, or citizens to secede. The premise of secession is that all political wholes are subject to the will of political parts. The problem identified by Lincoln is that any political part can be subdivided into smaller parts, the smallest and the most irreducible part being the individual. After individuals come to believe that they have a legal right to secede, to reject the outcome of any election, or reject any legislation without which they happen to disagree, the very idea of civil society under law becomes impossible. As Lincoln will argue in his first inaugural address, quote, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy, end quote. A state of anarchy, or a state of lawlessness, is a state characterized by the rule of might and definition of tyranny. Lincoln understood clearly that, quote, state sovereignty, end quote, and secession represents nothing less than a movement away from civil society, back towards a state of nature, a movement away from freedom under law, towards slavery without law. What Lincoln demonstrated in speech the Confederacy was proving in practice. By 1864, leading Georgians, including Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens and Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown, who were vehemently opposed to conscription, the suspension of habeas corpus, and the centralized of Confederate government power, were considering leading a secession movement for Georgia to lead the Confederacy. Had the South won the war and gained the independence it sought, the Confederacy likely would have been dissolved by multiple internal secessions. For the founders and Lincoln, sovereignty originates in the fact that by nature each man owns himself. By nature no man is the property of another man. A national or political sovereignty is derived from this original sovereignty. National sovereignty is legitimate only when it rests upon the consent of the sovereign individuals who form the original social compact, and only when the body politic protects the rights of those individuals. James Madison provided what is perhaps the most succinct account of sovereignty in his 1835 essay titled, quote, on sovereignty, end quote, in which he offered to, quote, go to the bottom of the subject, end quote. So let us consult the theory, end quote. Madison wrote, which contemplates a certain number of individuals as meeting and agreeing to form one political society, in order that the rights, the safety, and the interests of each may be under the safeguard of the whole. The first supposition is that each individual being previously independent of the others, the compact which is to make them one society must result from the free consent of every individual, end quote. According to Madison, it is by, quote, compact, end quote, that the natural freedom and independence of each individual is transformed into a sovereign people. It was by virtue of such popular sovereignty that citizens of several colonies declared their independence from Great Britain, and their union with each other adopted the Articles of Confederation, and later replaced those articles with the, quote, more perfect union, end quote, of the Constitution. As a civil society or the body politic is a voluntary association, the first and most fundamental characteristics of a free society arises from the first and most fundamental characteristic of social compact. By the supposition mentioned by Madison that each individual had been independent prior to the compact, means that there had been no relationship of governing or being governed between them. That is to say that the state of nature, and by nature each individual is equal in authority to every other, no one having more claim to the obedience of another than another has claim to obedience from him. It is only by virtue of each person's recognition of this equality and those with whom he contracts to form a civil society that the legitimate civil society can be formed. He's talked about the compact theory of Jefferson Davis transformed the founder's understanding of self-government. Mrs. Jefferson Davis presented self-government primarily as a right, a principle. Several months after assuming the presidency of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis addressed the Confederate Congress justifying the war for southern independence as a struggle, quote, for the sacred right of self-government and the privileges of free men, end quote. By contrast, he asserted in a letter during the first 6 months of the war that the people of the United States now, quote, separated from the South and left entirely to themselves, demonstrated their utter incapacity for self-government, end quote. By curtailing freedom of the press and suspending the right of habeas corpus for Southerners, the war concerned one core, quote, issue, end quote. It says, quote, will you be slaves? Will you consent to be robbed of your property, that is slaves, to be reduced to provincial dependence? Will you renounce the exercise of those rights with which you were born and which were transmitted to you by your fathers, end quote. The right not to be enslaved in order, among other things, to enjoy the service of slaves may appear paradoxical. The paradox disappears if self-government is conceived as being ancestral, not a right of human beings as such, but a right passed down from parents to children. So Davis sometimes describes self-government as, quote, the birthright of freedom and equality, end quote. One among the, quote, inalienable rights inherited from our ancestors, end quote. Southerners, quote, are not engaged in a quixotic fight for the rights of man. Our struggle is for inherited rights, end quote. The unalienable, God-endowed rights enunciated in the Declaration of Independence inhere in human beings as members of political communities. Quote, men were created equal, meaning the men of the political community, end quote, wrote Davis. Not men as such, indeed, quote, had the Declaration of Independence announced that the Negroes were free and equal. How was the Prince George III to be arranged for stirring up insurrection among them, end quote. The right to self-government preceded the union of the states when political union no longer protected this birthright. No longer protected this birthright, the union had to be dissolved. Quote, the Declaration of Independence recognized the right of secession under circumstances of oppression or injustice, end quote. Circumstances that obtained in the South as early as 1850 when the, quote, Great Compromise, end quote, solemnized the encirclement of slave states by free states. It says, and so arguing, Davis followed the argument of his political mentor, John C. Calhoun, as stated to the young journalist Oliver Dyer in 1849. Denying what Washington had asserted, that the United States is a nation, Calhoun said that the sovereignty of the several peoples of the states, quote, is inalienable and perpetually resides where its creator originally placed it, in the hearts and minds of the individual free man, end quote. By melding in natural right, a moral principle, with sovereignty, a political fact, and by additional restricting that fact and right to free man, Calhoun brushes aside the right of the enslaved to rebel. Self-government is for those who govern themselves by the will of God. Yeah, by the time of his 1881 Apologia, the rise and fall of the Confederate government, Davis redefined self-government as a universal natural right. Again, citing the Declaration, he called, quote, civil and political sovereignty, quote, a right, quote, implanted by our Creator in the individual. This is, quote, in, quote, humanity, end quote. The Reconstruction South, wherein many, quote, white citizens, end quote, were disenfranchised, wherein, quote, the sovereignty of the people was extinct, and those who ruled had bayonets on their side, end quote. The South, where such voters as remain, were prey to their own, quote, ignorance, end quote, and, quote, lawless passions, end quote, exploited by, quote, a body of political adventurers from the northern states, greedy for power and plunder, end quote. The South had this South had seen not merely the invasion of northern armies, but the, quote, invasion of the natural and unalienable rights of man, end quote. Quote, when the cause was lost, what cause was it? Not that of the South only, but the cause of constitutional government, of the supremacy of law, and of the natural rights of man, end quote. The discrepancy may be explained, if not really justified, by noting the difference between Davis's rhetorical circumstance in 1881 and his rhetorical circumstance before and during the war. By 1881, he no longer exhorted southerners who ruled slaves. He now appealed to slaveless southerners and, more broadly, to all Americans. He continued the war by other verbal means. Quote, the contest is not over, the strife is not ended, it has only entered on a new and enlarged arena, end quote. The, quote, physical strength of the northern states, end quote, has been demonstrated conclusively. Quote, force may prevail over right, but cannot destroy truth, end quote. Quote, truth is not to be measured by success in maintaining it against force, end quote. Quote, all else is thus in the balance when weighed with honor and duty, end quote. Quote, a higher standard than the common tests of success, end quote. Freed of the rhetorical obligation to defend slaveholding, Davis could now defend self-government as a natural right and not only as a birthright, although it remained that too. As a right, self-government inheres first of all in the individual, like the presidents of the founding generation. Davis regarded self-government as a duty as well as a political right. He conceived a personal self-mastery as adherence to a principle. And then it goes on to talk about how Davis understood the government of the self. You see, he doesn't even operate on the same presuppositions. He does not operate on the same presuppositions of our Constitution as established with Washington and even the Pilgrims. So you can find it in some of the Puritan things called Constitution, right, or covenants about the slaves, and so you can find plenty of Pilgrims that were against that as well. Because I know it's like this one guy's quoted me this quote from Jefferson Davis talking about how this president loves the Constitution, wants to keep it, right? But at the same time, he does not interpret it the same way. That's why I said it's a different presupposition altogether, a different kind of America. That's why I said the American Confederacy is more like, just like American Marxism and communism, is nothing but heresy, demonic heresy, a distortion. American heresy, because it just has so many similarities. What we see today, right? I see it virtually as the same battle for America's soul, the interpretation of the country, with the critical racism, how it's kind of nothing new. It's nothing but distortions of our founding. How all of the anti-American, anti-patriotic people, right? They seem to be using the Confederacy to define America, full of the presuppositions of their ideas. I think it was called the Dred Scott case and stuff like that, which is another Supreme Court that's an error. That was an error, right? The court systems are always making mistakes, getting things wrong. Like this book, I like this book. It's called The Covenant, Lincoln and the War, Preserving the Sacred Promise of One Nation Under God by Timothy Ballard. I mean, I like his books because they take from the, they build upon the understanding of the covenantal understanding. Even though I may not agree with everything with these authors, but I certainly like that they account for it, try to build off of it. Maybe this chapter is talking about the anti-Lincolnites. This chapter 5. This is to be ultra is to go beyond. It is to champion things to the point of becoming their enemy. It is to be so pro you become con. Victor Hugo, 1862. Thus far we have only scratched the surface of the evidence that Lincoln and the North had been converted by God to the covenant. But before delving into the more profound evidence of this powerful conversion and how it was put to use, we will first discuss why it is so important for us to recognize the significance of this conversion. Too many do not recognize it and therefore fall into strange and inaccurate perceptions of the Civil War and Lincoln's place in it. There even exists today a small but dedicated and growing group of students of the Constitution who will refer to as, quote, theorists, end quote, who reject that Lincoln was a man of God and sent to preserve the rights of God's children. In fact, these theorists, most of which identify themselves as, quote, libertarian, end quote, suggest just the opposite is true. So the theorist's argument is based on the notion that Lincoln fought the Civil War for the purpose of saving the Union. That is, he, quote, authorized, end quote, the death of over 600,000 Americans because of his subjective and wrong interpretation of what the, quote, Union, end quote, meant under the Constitution. So Lincoln believed the South had to Lincoln believed the South had no right to secede, and that, quote, according to the theorists, was his justification for war. The theorists believed that the South had every right to leave, and and so they are outraged that Lincoln instructed Union soldiers, quote, to begin killing the people and destroying the property of the separatists, end quote, simply because of the separatists, the South's, quote, desire to withdraw from the Union, end quote. The theories claim Lincoln's intent was based, end quote, love of money and dominion, end quote. Further, they deny history and evidence, such as that recently presented, and claim the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to free the slaves. It is absolutely true that Lincoln believed the South had no right to leave the Union. The theorists do their best to convince us that Lincoln was way off base in the argument. The theorists, for example, ask us to read the rather vague words of James Madison, once used to describe how the Union was composed. They then ask us to conclude that Madison believed in the right for states to secede. What the theorists don't ask us to read are James Madison's words when he specifically addressed not broad-brushed concepts of constitutional law, but the actual issue of secession. Recall Madison was alive to witness South Carolina's first effort in 1832 to leave the Union. Madison's response was as follows, quote, it is high time that the claim to secede at will should be put down by the public opinion, end quote. He declared that if states proposed twin rights to nullify federal law, quote, nullification, end quote, and leave the Union, quote, secession, end quote, are the, quote, twin heresies, end quote, that, quote, ought to be buried in the same grave, end quote. If Lincoln was off base, he was in good company with the, quote, father of the Constitution, end quote. Andrew Jackson was the president during this time of possible secession, 1832 through 1833. As a staunch defender of state rights over the federal government, he has long been a hero to the theorist cause. Jackson also weighed in heavily on the issue of the right of sovereign secession. Though the theorists, ironically, would not like what he had to say. Quote, our Union, end quote, he declared, quote, it must be preserved, end quote. He stated that, quote, to call the right to secede from the Union a constitutional right is confounding the meaning of terms and can can only be done through gross error, end quote. Jackson then passed the Force Act in January 1833, which gave him his sought-after congressional authority to send the federal military into the rebellious state to stop the secession by force if necessary. The South then backed down. Then the South backed down. The theorists do not encourage their students to read this account either. These same theorists also tried to convince us of a state's rights to secede using colonial era descriptions that define the state's very weak relationship with the national government. Indeed, the descriptions do suggest that the state's collective bond under the Union might easily and lawfully be cracked. The problem is that the only convincing descriptions the theorists offer as proof were made prior to the Union being created by the Constitution. They cite the relationship forged under the weak Articles of Confederation and pretend that this standard of, quote, union, end quote, was the same as the standard set later by the Constitution. This is like a doctor trying to diagnose a health problem, not using the patient's data from the current illness, but using data from a previous illness years ago. Similarly, they point us to the words of Madison recorded during the Constitutional Convention, words used by the bickering delegates during the hotly contested debates. The delegates use words like, quote, voluntary, end quote, sovereignty, end quote, and, quote, compact, end quote. They use these words to draw vague conclusions. Furthermore, these words are taken from arguments made prior to the final product. It represents differing opinion, but this is not a conclusive voice that can offer any conclusive definition of the Union or the right to secede from it. These tactics by the theorists are both deceptive and misleading. Though the theorists make weak arguments, pretending they are strong, the truth is we could spend all day debating a state's right to secede and never come to an easy conclusion, for the Constitution is quiet on this issue. Unlike the Constitution, the commentators from the founding to the present have been loud, but they have also been widely diverse in their opinions, and so as there were never definitive lines drawn about a state's right to secede, nobody knew what to do when it started happening at the end of 1860. Then when the South began seizing and attacking federal property like forts and ports in the South, thus consummating his decision to leave, Lincoln understandably responded militarily. The federal government was under attack by the spring of 1861. The war had begun. But this is where the theories get thoroughly confused, that they want to believe that Lincoln continued his fight, his endless push for death and bloodshed over the constitutionally murky argument regarding the right to secede. They completely miss the central theme of the conflict. This is what happens when we fail to see the conflict through the clarity of the American covenant, and when we close our eyes to Lincoln and the North's great conversion to this covenant. The war may have begun over issues related to rights of secession, but Lincoln and his people learned that it was actually about something very different. As Lincoln wrote in a memo to himself, not intended to be made public, quote, God's purpose for this war is something different from the purpose of either party. I am almost ready to say that it is probably true that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet, end quote. We have already seen ample proof, and we will see even more proof in later chapters, that Lincoln learned in no uncertain terms that God was administering this war as a punishment to purge the nation, both North and South, of sin. Lincoln's understanding of this was the result of his heaven-induced conversion. He knew and thus stated that the war was, quote, a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins, to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people. This is, end quote. Lincoln had caught God's vision and desire for national repentance, that universal liberty might at last reign. He worked as God's instrument in fulfilling prophecies, as will be seen in later chapter. This is Lincoln put his words into action when he rejected the South's proposal to finally agree to his original offer and return to the Union with slavery intact. Once converted to the real cause, Lincoln took that option off the table, even though it meant the war must go on. Indeed, the war was now about freedom for the oppressed, not just unification. Though the theorists do not acknowledge this fact of history, it is clear that the war meant much more to Lincoln than mere unification. Seen in this light, the argument over, quote, right of secession, end quote, becomes completely irrelevant. We're talking about a higher laws here. We are talking about the national covenant God had placed the entire promised land under, both North and South. Neither side was going to duck out of this one, and not even by the best constitutional argument that it is a right to secede and thereby maintain an iniquitous system of governance, which system of governance was clearly responsible for keeping the covenant constitutional blessings out of the hands of the slaves and others. God would not have it, for it was this very iniquity in both the North and the South that God was trying to strip the nation of in preparation for the revitalization and dissemination of liberty unto eternal salvation. And so the theorists may continue to blame Lincoln for administering the scourge and vexation, but evidence suggests that it wasn't Lincoln, it was God. Lincoln had become, as he claimed himself to be, nothing but, quote, a humble instrument in the hands of our Heavenly Father, end quote. But the theories of the theorists become stranger still. They claim that the liberty they love was lost because of the war. Quote, what the people lost during the Civil War, the Great War of Coruscant, we have yet to get back, end quote. So claim the theorists. They encourage us to believe that, quote, Lincoln himself became the principal instigator of America's suicide, end quote, and that his Civil War, quote, ended the founder's dream in America, end quote. What theorists are referring to is the fact that the state sovereignty or state rights had been damaged by the advent of the Civil War fruit, an empowered federal government. More particularly, this fruit of war was largely represented by the 14th Amendment, which mandated the federal government to intervene in the states to restore basic civil rights to the innocent and suffering. That the theorists seem to turn a blind eye to the fact that this amendment restored liberty to all, and instead focused on the fact that it allowed the federal government to grow, which is something the theorists despise. The theorists claimed that the amendment was, quote, foisted upon the states, end quote. Definition of foist, quote, to force upon or impose fraudulently or unjustifiably, end quote. Did the theorists really believe things were better in America before the 14th Amendment, before the federal government had a mandate to intervene in states that sucked away the promised blessings of the Constitution? Do we really need to revisit again the plight of racial and religious minorities? Beating, starvation, sexual abuse, separation of families, extermination, cold-blooded murder, all this was administered or condoned by state governments. These atrocities are the real things we lost because of the war. Do we want these back? Is this the Constitution we want? Do we really want to return to the pre-war interpretation of it? What, quote, the people lost, end quote, pursuant to the war was not liberty, but the opposite of liberty. The only thing we really lost was wicked oppressors who utilized state governments to work the most ungodly works yet ever known to our nation. The theorists may believe the original intent of the Constitution was to have state preserve and promote the great blessings of liberty, but to argue that the states were doing a fine job of this is to absolutely deny history. If the states had done their job, the war and the 14th Amendment would not have been needed. God will correct his children if he had to influence an amendment to the Constitution for the sake of preserving liberty, and for the sake of securing his covenant with his people. Of course, he will do it. This is not a difficult concept to internalize. There are a few groups in American society that should especially understand this concept. The Christian conservative libertarians are one of them. And now we are back to Lincoln as the chosen one to carry out God's will in this matter. He did just that. Not only did he do it, but the manner in which he did it only confirms his divine mission. As we have seen and will further see, Lincoln carried out this mission through his conversion and through his prophetic and spiritually moving words and actions. But that is, as is the fate of almost any prophet of God, when Lincoln's words and actions are divorced from the spiritual context in which they came forth, Lincoln is written off by some, as many prophets were, as a tyrant, a dictator, a madman, or worse. One prominent theorist claims not to know whether Lincoln was a good man or a bad man. only that he made a series of foolish and wrong-headed decisions based on bad advice. The same theorist, however, also claims that Lincoln was the, quote, principal instigator of American suicide, end quote, and that, quote, the fundamentals, end quote, of his, quote, national policy, end quote, included the, quote, love of money and dominion, end quote. This begs the question, how could Lincoln be both a good man and maintain such sinister intentions, even, quote, authorizing, end quote, the death of over 600,000 people, just to realize these selfish and power-mongering ends. Indeed, such false, mean, confused, and gurgled labels have always and will always be laid upon the servants of God by those who do not understand. The theorists claim Lincoln led us into a, quote, second founding, end quote, which they describe as wicked. Perhaps it was a, quote, second founding, end quote, but it is anything but wicked, for the, quote, first founding, end quote, was great on paper, but not in practice. We should thank God for the, quote, second founding, end quote. Millions of Americans who are free at last to exercise their agency and realize the American dream certainly do. The theorists might also argue that the states protect civil rights today and not the federal government. There is truth to this, though the federal government still involves itself in matters of civil rights. However, this is a relatively recent trend, since the Civil Rights Movement only occurred because the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act stood as a powerful force of God's influence upon the states, a force to ensure that states adopted a policy of full moral agency. Today, as God designed, the states have adhered, but the federal government still stands as the late originator and as the current check and backup. This is the theorists interpret Lincoln's efforts as a scheme to create a, quote, domestic empire under control of an all-powerful central government, end quote. Not so. Lincoln simply brought the federal government to the level where it could stop the pain caused by the, quote, state rights, end quote, doctrine. The same level where Madison wanted it in the first place. He brought it to a point where it could serve as a check against iniquitous states that abused African Americans, Jews, Mormons, Catholics, and others. But has the federal government not grown in power beyond its constitutional bounds? And was the federal government not afforded the opportunity to thus grow because Lincoln gave it its first significant dose of power? The answer to these questions is yes, but to blame Lincoln for that is akin to saying that because God gave us the internet so we might more easily evangelize, for example, he is also responsible for the pornography that came with it. It's ridiculous. Furthermore, whatever federal increases and abuses of power have come about since the Civil War, and while we must be aware of them and always push back against them in appropriate governance, they do not even approximate the sins derived of, quote, state rights, end quote, that prevailed before the war. They do not even hint at enslaving because of race or murdering because of religion. Let us keep some perspective. What about the fact that Lincoln did stretch the limits of the Constitution during the war? For example, it is a fact that he suspended the right of habeas corpus and did other things that pushed the limits or even violated the strictest interpretation of the Constitution. It is true that presumably innocent people lost their rights due to these wartime policies. It is easy to argue. It is easy to argue that Lincoln was wrong to do this. Perhaps he was wrong, but remember he was the president in a capital city that was embedded geographically in the middle of the South. He laid his head on a pillow each night in a residence that was less than 100 miles away from the Confederate capital. In the bloodiest war America has ever been involved in, the commander-in-chief was completely surrounded and inundated with rebels and traitors to his cause. They severely threatened the godly vision he sought to bring to the world. Perhaps a strong hand saved the very Constitution he was accused of violating. It was a difficult decision he had to make, said Lincoln, quote, it became necessary for me to choose whether, using only the existing means, agencies, and processes which Congress had provided, I should let the government fall at once into ruin, or whether, availing myself of the broader powers conferred by the Constitution in cases of insurrection, I would make an effort to save it with all its blessings for the present age and for posterity. Specifically addressing his decision to suspend the right of habeas corpus, Lincoln explained that as president it was his job to ensure, quote, that the laws be faithfully executed, end quote, and that a major portion of the states had subverted the, quote, whole of the laws, end quote, to include God's laws. Lincoln wondered aloud what nation would gain by him maintaining one law, habeas corpus, at the expense of allowing traitors to subvert all the others and destroy the government. Asked Lincoln, quote, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces, lest that one be violated, end quote. Whatever questionable or even wrong wartime powers Lincoln assumed during the war, during this war over man's personal liberty, they are a drop in the bucket relative to what God was doing here for the Promised Land. Not only were these drastic measures very temporary, but we must remember they were in the furtherance of a foreordained war, whose purpose was to provide the fertile ground for God's Christian church and kingdom to flourish forevermore and not be threatened as it was by wicked politics. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson declared that, quote, if the freedom of religion guarantees us by the law and theory can ever rise in practice, truth will prevail, and the genuine doctrines of Jesus, so long perverted by his pseudo-priests, will again be restored to their original purity, end quote. Jefferson knew that even in his twilight years, at the very end of the Revolutionary generation, the glorious Constitution was yet but a theory. The, quote, first founding, end quote, was awesome and wonderful, but sadly it had not as of yet risen from theory to practice. Unfortunately, wicked man had hijacked its original divine intent, which requires God to step in. His intervention is clearly reflected and Jefferson's prophecy fulfilled in history. For Lincoln did take this theory and the direction of God Almighty brought it into practice, that what the theorists lament so much, what they call, quote, the second founding, end quote, actually brought the blessings of the Constitution for the first time into practice, and the genuine doctrines of Jesus have again been restored to their original purity. They have taken root in the land and gone forth more boldly than ever because of that liberty won by Lincoln in the Civil War. Just having addressed these issues, what might we learn here about blinding ourselves to God's designs for America and her covenant? What the theorists have done in this case, and what they are striving to do still, is to put forth a principle which they themselves have largely devised. They believe that they have tapped into the unified voice and singular intent of the founders. The problem for anyone who has studied the founders is that there was seldom a unified voice. Yes, they all believed in liberty unto salvation, and they believed God was behind it, but they had very different ideas about how to achieve this liberty. This is why the Constitution, as inspired as it was, is often vague and open to much interpretation. The bickering colonists could not get too specific so as to not offend each other's opinions, thus causing a state to walk away from the table and thus failing to design, quote, a more perfect union, end quote. Even two of our greatest revolutionaries, Jefferson and Adams, were once best friends, did not speak to each other for years on end because of disagreements pertaining to how the Constitution should be applied. For the theorists to claim there was a solid unitary voice, what they call the, quote, first founding, end quote, and that they have today figured out precisely what that voice was, is highly presumptuous, if not a bit arrogant. The result of such presumptions is that the theorists draw a nice little box and fill it with notions of how things were always meant to be. In this case, the notions include that states have a right to secede from the Union, and the federal government does not have the right to grow. There are few, if any, exceptions to these rules. However, we have seen that many founders, sustained by God, did not maintain these same notions. When the theorists identify violations of their notions, they began accusing so many people of being traitorous, followers of Satan. Innocent bodies fall everywhere in their wake, and conspiracy theories abound. This is what they have done to Lincoln. This is not to say we should not be mindful of evil lurking, because it is, but we need to see things in full perspective. We need to read history with all the facts, not just the ones that fit into our little box. We need to read history with the scriptures in our hands. We need to read it with the American covenant always in the forefront of our minds. God and covenant created the Constitution. Our subjective interpretation of the Constitution, therefore, must be subservient to our God and to our covenant. So let us heed the counsel of the statement attributed to James Madison as we interpret the Constitution and history. We should, quote, not separate text from historical background. If you do, you will have perverted and subverted the Constitution, which can only end in a distorted, bastardized form of illegitimate government, end quote. By separating Lincoln from historical background and covenant context, the theorists have offered up a distorted, bastardized, and illegitimate interpretation of Lincoln and history. When all we are willing to see is what we have placed in our little box, we fall into a trap. It's a trap that can lead us to call good evil and evil good. Indeed, we yelp for liberty with so much fire that the very thing that brings our liberty ends up burnt. It is a trap that the great French philosopher and politician Victor Hugo identified in his classic Les Miserables. He called it being, quote, ultra, end quote. To be ultra is to go beyond, is to attack, this is the quote, it says to, quote, to be ultra is to go beyond, is to attack the scepter in the name of the throne and the mitre in the name of the altar. It is to mistreat the thing you support. It is to insult through an excess of respect. It is to find too little papistry in the Pope, and the King too little royalty, and too much light in the night. It is to be dissatisfied with the albatross, with snow, with the swan and the lily for not being white enough. It is to champion things to the point of becoming their enemy. It is to be so pro you become con. End quote. This is as I have met with groups of Christians to present the research found in this book. I've often been approached by the people who had always exposed to the theorist's conclusions about Lincoln. And on every occasion, attendees, often with tears in their eyes, have expressed gratitude for their pro-Lincoln material. Quote, it has restored my faith in Lincoln, end quote. I hear them say, again and again, they have often told me that something deep inside them whispered that the allegations hurled against him were not true. In spite of what the theorists claimed Lincoln was, in fact, the servant of God they have always believed him to be. Of course, they felt this truth. Lincoln led the way back into the protection of the covenant. It is for those enlightened souls who I have come in contact with and others like them that I have written this note on the anti-Lincoln movement. It is for them that I have included all this research on the true Lincoln, that they might be empowered with the history that validates and confirms their spiritual manifestations about the great man and his mission. He was not just one of many founders for this mission that he was called to do, and for laying his own life upon the altar to do it. He was perhaps the greatest founder. It is time we defend him with the truth. As stated, the assurance of the Emancipation Proclamation was only the beginning. It merely represented one of the first of the many manifestations to follow, manifestations of the great conversion that would bring about God's plan for America and her covenant. And so we now continue the story. So yeah, this is a very good book that I really enjoyed. So I just felt the need to, basically to defend Lincoln. Like, I don't believe he was in the wrong. I believe he had more consistency with God, covenant, and country. I don't agree with these anti-Lincolnites, And so I found myself agreeing more with him, agreeing more with him, because I listened to both sides of the issue. Anyway, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.